Good morning. I'm based here in the United States in California. Good afternoon, good evening. I know we have folks joining from many different time zones. It's inspiring to see so many people wanting to be part of this conversation today, so thank you. My name's Allison Wright. I direct the Environmental Defenders Collaborative, which is a pooled fund that supports frontline land and environmental activists and their allies and advocates globally. We are a proud partner of the Oakland Institute. I'm so happy to see such robust interest in this latest report of OI's on the destructive community impacts of Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya. And I'm grateful for the opportunity today, as I'm sure all of you are, to hear directly from some of the leaders who contributed to the report's findings. Anuradha asked me to say a few words about the wider context that this discussion fits within. Within the funding world, we've seen an inspiring increase over the last years on the situation of land and environmental defenders. And at the beginning of any discussion on this theme, I think it's important to remind ourselves who we're talking about. Land and environmental defenders are people. They're leaders, they're mothers and fathers, they're farmers, they're herdsmen. They're people who, thanks to intentional activism in some cases, but just as often to the fact that their traditional lands are being targeted for business development, face tremendous risks of violence, repression, and criminalization. The reports and the findings of watchdog groups like Amnesty International and Global Witness tally numbers, and indeed, more defenders are being killed, threatened, criminalized, and attacked than ever before. The global pandemic has only exacerbated these trends. It's taken attention and resources in other directions. It's provided a guise for the repression of civil society at many levels. And maybe most importantly, the pandemic has contributed even more to an economic context in which the pro-business paradigm has so much traction. That pro-business paradigm manifests across all regions. And while communities in different parts of the world face unique risks and challenges, there are common threads that connect the frontline experience of those who are seeking to speak truth to power. And one really critical central common theme is that frontline leaders increasingly find themselves standing up to entities and to projects that are ostensibly being undertaken with community interests in mind. Across so many extractivist sectors, business actors and their government partners have become very adept at framing their efforts in a positive light, using words like community-driven and participatory. So whether it's an open pit mine, a multi-country pipeline, or fortress conservation, which is what we'll be focusing on today, these projects are framed in a way that prioritizes supposedly local livelihoods and local empowerment. But we know that these terms are euphemisms, and we know that on the ground, the experience is much different. That experience is also often silenced, and the voices of the communities on the front lines of these struggles too often go unheard. So today is a unique opportunity to hear some of those voices directly. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it back to you, Anuradha.
Thank you, Allison. Environmental Defender Collaborative and Tikwa Grassroots Empowerment Fund, if I may mention them as well, are at the forefront of the struggle to protect land defenders and to help reframe the debate on conservation. I also want to acknowledge the team at the Oakland Institute that made this event possible today, in particular, Andy Currier. And to everyone joining us today, greetings from Oakland. My name is Anuradha Mittal. I'm the Executive Director of the Oakland Institute. I'm also the co-author of the report, Stealth Gang, which was done with Zara Molu. Very deeply appreciate the participants. Right now, we have 159 participants. Over 350 participants had registered, joining from around the globe to hear the land defenders from Northern Kenya who are resisting NRT, Northern Rangelands Trust, to protect their lives, livelihoods, and their culture. This event is being streamed live on Facebook, and a recording will be made available as well. If you have questions, as said before, please share your questions in the Q&A section. Please don't post them on chat. Please use the Q&A section. For our panelists, I'm going to request that we mute ourselves and when we are not speaking. A word about the Institute. The Oakland Institute is an independent think tank. We do not accept any government or corporate funding. Our rigorous research, our campaigning is at the request of the impacted communities to hold the powerful accountable. Our report Stealth Game is a result of over 2.5 years of work based on extensive field research. Now, this work actually started as an inquiry into the impact of Lapset Corridor, a so-called development scheme with oil pipelines, highways, resort towns, and more on the pastoralist community. The communities I visited and met with, the Samberu, Maasai, Borana, and others, however, wanted to talk about the NRT and not the Lapset Corridor. At every meeting, family members showed up to offer testimony of the killings of their loved ones by rangers. This is the genesis of this report. The communities reported they had written to government authorities. They had gone to the Kenyan police. They had petitioned the donors, the Western donors. They had conducted their own fact-finding missions. And they faced threats and continued abuses. They even went to court. But all of this was met with silence. Stealth Game shatters that silence. And today, your presence on this webinar helps elevate communities' voices further. We invited donors and other supporters of the NRT to this webinar. Some expressed that since NRT is not present on this webinar, they cannot be there. The truth is that NRT has had access and an international audience all this time, and we wanted to ensure that the voices of the communities who are impacted by so-called conservation of NRT are raised today. One thing is clear, that the silence and inaction on part of the donors is no longer an option. You will hear what we exposed in Stealth Game, the devastating impact of privatized, neo-colonial, racist wildlife conservation and safari tourism on indigenous pastoralist communities. As Alison said, that terms like participatory, community-driven, local empowerment are extensively used. But our report revealed how the NRT and Kenya Wildlife Services have allegedly dispossessed pastoralist communities of their ancestral lands through corruption, co-optation, through intimidation and violence to create wildlife conservancies for conservation dollars. Since its founding in 2004, NRT has set up 43 conservancies, so-called community conservancies, on over 42,000 square kilometers of land in northern and coastal Kenya. Nearly 8% of the country's total land area. It is pretty stunning that a so-called NGO can control so much of land in Kenya. While NRT claims that its goal is to transform people's lives, secure peace, conserve natural resources, communities which are predominantly pastoralists, they allege that NRT dispossesses them of the land and deploys armed security units which are involved in serious human rights abuses. NRT is also involved in security, management of pasture land, livestock marketing. This gives it a level of control that surpasses even that of the Kenyan government. NRT was created by Ian Craig, whose family was part of an elite white minority during British colonialism. NRT's origins date back to the 1980s when Craig's family owned 62,000-acre cattle ranch was transformed into its first conservancy. Today, NRT receives millions of dollars in funding from donors including USAID, the European Union, Danish, French development agencies, and large environmental NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, Space for Giants, among others. As I mentioned earlier, impacted communities have organized protests, they have signed petitions, they have initiated legal action against the presence of NRT on their lands. Community members have repeatedly asked for justice after years of being ignored by the Kenyan government and by the police when reporting killings of family members and other human rights abuses. You will hear these testimonies today. Our report called for an urgent independent investigation into land and human rights related grievances around NRT's community conservancies, including allegations of involvement of NRT's rapid response units in inter-ethnic conflict and of abuses and extrajudicial killings. We were pleased to learn last week that following the release of our report, NRT donors are launching a formal investigation. It is, however, important that it is not a sham investigation merely to clear their names. They need to actually meet the impacted communities and see the reality on the ground. While that is happening, I'll introduce to you the first speaker from Kenya, Major Jillo. Major Jillo is a community activist and a member of the Borana Council of Elders. And today he is here with us to share the struggle from the Biliko Bulesa Conservancy. Major Jillo, I turn it over to you. Please unmute yourself.
Jambo, everybody. I'm glad to be on the panel. Biliko Bulesa Conservancy was formed in 2007, and the first chairman of the committee, which were handpicked, is called the Baso Ali Dogo. And when it is covering over 320,000 hectares of land. It's a vast rangeland, mainly used by livestock and wildlife for pasture and water. Now, NRT broke actually all the verbal promises they made to the communities, including denial of the access of the pasture land. Insecurity were escalated through imbalances of the security in the region. And the first chairman, the Baso Ali Dogo, actually blew the whistle when he found that things are not going the way the community were told. The Council of Elders were not included, they were sidelined. The public participation was not done. So a lot of cattle rustling incidences happened. Many killings occurred. And as a result of that, the first chairman blew the whistle. The Council of Elders, jointly with the professional groups, came in, carried out their own investigation, and the elders passed resolution in March 2019 for the NRT to move out of the rangeland. This has never been complied by NRT. Then the community carried out several demonstrations and wrote a lot of petitions to the government agencies and to the donor countries, the USAID, the French development agencies, the DANIDA, and this actually happened. I mean, NRT kept on extending, despite this, kept on extending for the new conservancies to the southern part in 4 administrative wards. And that is the time now the community went to court. And right now, we're in court. We participated in the launch of the stealth game report by Oakland Institute.
Thank you, Major Jillo. Are you done with your?
Yes, I think 4 minutes are over, or rather 5 minutes are over.
Well, I hope when the question and answers, you will share more. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Lupke, a community activist, a journalist, and a filmmaker from the Samburu community. Jeff, are you with us? I think we lost Jeff. I'm going to turn it over to you, Isaiah. Isaiah is a community activist who will be sharing the struggle of how NRT is using the Pokot Ranges and scouts to displace communities in Baringo, North and South. Isaiah, if you would unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anota Mittal. My name is Isaiah Biwot from Baringo County. I'm a community activist. I'm a land activist by another name. Currently, the problem that we have in Baringo started in 2004. And it started in Baringo South, where we have two communities, that is Pokot and Iljamos community, which is a sub-tribe of Maasai community. The two communities coexisted peacefully in an area called Mukutani, in another area called Rukos, and another place called Komolion. Then in 2005, displacement and the communities which used to be living together became very fierce enemies. Initially, we thought this is normal, but after the Bokot Rangers started stealing cows and displacing the Ilchamos community, those who had been displaced moved away to the upper side of near Marika town. But when they want to come back to the community, to their lands, because there are, apart from rearing livestock, they also had some small irrigation schemes that they used to plant crops. When they came back, their houses, the rangers started killing them. They started shooting children and women. And this is when we realized that the war is not actually about cattle raids. The war actually was about the land question. And in 2009, this fighting continued from 2004 up to 2009. And suddenly we realized that there is a conservancy which had been secretly registered called Ruko Conservancy. And it was sponsored by NRT, and they had 4-wheel drive vehicles, which was given by NRT. And when the community wanted to complain about how the land which people were displaced were given out as conservancy, their complaints fell on deaf ears. And in 2015, we organized a demonstration to inquire why NRT has been with other conservancies, including the Cookie Kalman Conservancy, were blocking all the routes that the community used to be using to go and water their livestock. And after that, some of our colleagues, including the local member of County Assembly, was killed, was assassinated in a very funny way to silence the voice of the community. Two other community leaders, an engineer and another member of County Assembly, were also executed at the dead of the night near a town called Marikat, because they were the voices who were opposing the establishment of the Ruko Conservancy and other conservancies which were secretly registered without the consent or without public participation. So these attacks have been continuing. Currently, as we are speaking, 2 days ago, several houses were touched on the upper side of Ruko Conservancy near the Cookie Kalman, first, I think over 50,000 hectares. And the community are actually complaining that the raids are not actually traditional cultural cattle raids, but they are panning the houses to chase the people away, because that is what had been happening. This expansion and raids are actually targeting community lands which have not been demarcated, that have no title deeds. And most of the lower sides of near like Bokoria and Baringo are holding huge deposits of rubies, oil, and geothermal. And what made us suspect that there is a hand of these other people is the NRT and another proxy is that vehicles branded with NRT are not attacked, but any other vehicle which does not belong to the partners are being shot, and it becomes so insecure that community members who are even harvesting their honey at night are being shot. This points out clearly that the attacks is about the land, displace the people, chase them away from their rangeland, where they had their livestock. And this is happening even as we speak. The presence of several government security agencies have not helped anything because the raiders just pass by and nothing happens. They steal the cows, they burn the houses, and they just go away. They don't get control. People are getting killed, they're getting displaced. And in Baringo North, where I come from, we're being displaced in the upper side of a place called Partapua. A week ago, 2 people were killed by the same Pokot Rangers who are being used by these people that they are pushing so much for conservation. Even when the fight is going on now, there are some established. NRT are actually the ones doing mobilization for the formation of these conservancies. I've tried so much to raise this issue with other community members, and we are being threatened. We should stop talking about it.
Thank you, Zaya.
The people.
Thank you, Zaya. I want to make sure
Thank
that
you.
everyone has an opportunity. I can see a very robust conversation in the chat box. As we move forward to Jeff, Jeff, you will have a brief 4 minutes or so to share the struggle from the Sambero community. I wanted to share that the field research by the Oakland Institute, I was a part of the team myself. I visited communities where I saw hundreds of people show up, whether it was Kuma Mave or whether it was Biliko Bulesa. I took the testimonies myself from the mothers who lost their children, loved ones, family reporting where the brother was killed. So I fully agree that there are many who have a different opinion as they're sharing in the chat box. And this is why the Institute has called for an independent investigation. I want to make it clear that when the report was released, any of the panelists who are here did not contribute to it. They had not seen a copy of the report. The report was released, and that's when they got to see actually the report. I'd had no contact with whether it is Mordecai or with Isaiah. This is the first time I'm actually seeing him. I had met other community members. So I welcome the disagreements that are happening on the chat box. We welcome them, but it is really essential that the donors will be doing an investigation of their own. With that, Jeff, I turn it over to you if others would mute themselves. Jeff, if you can share, as I said before, an independent journalist, a community activist from the Sambero community, you have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, people from Kenya and maybe some parts of Africa, and good morning, the US. My name is Jefferson Lekupe.
Jeff, we don't hear you, I guess. I think Jeff has been having some internet issues. Jeff, do you want to turn off your camera so perhaps you'll have better connection?
Yeah, let me try that. Yeah, let me try that way.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please continue, Jeff. I'm going to move on to Violet. Violet Matiru is joining us from Nairobi. Violet started her career as a zoologist researcher with the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock, and then with the Elephant Program of the Kenya Wildlife Service, where she was part of the teams that conducted aerial and ground elephant population censuses. She has worked at the juncture of human-wildlife conflicts around national parks and reserves, and has been an important resource for the communities who are impacted by NRT's so-called community conservancies. Violet.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so to start with, I'd like to just point out that the dispossession of indigenous communities of their land that is happening under NRT is a culmination of a long-term strategy by the US government, especially through USAID. The US government and the European Union countries have been involved in the systematic destruction of indigenous institutions for the conservation of wildlife and other natural resources here in Kenya. The main focus has been to make wildlife a commodity, either for tourism, especially for rich white people, or even for hunting. Unfortunately, right from the beginning, the Kenya Wildlife Service was created by the political elite and handed over to the descendants of the British settlers, led by Richard Leakey, who proceeded to fill each key position with white people. The US government supported key programs through Kenya Wildlife Service to achieve the turning of wildlife into a commodity. From 1992 to 1998, it supported the COBRA project, conservation of biodiverse resource areas. Then this was followed by the CORE program, which was conservation of resources through enterprise, which was funded by USAID from 1999 to 2005. The biodiversity conservation program, on the other hand, was funded by the European Union from 1998 to 2006. These programs promoted the concept of communities setting aside land for conservation, also known as conservancies. The initial conservancies were established in the category of land that were registered as group ranches. And this is a category of land that was introduced by the World Bank that led to a lot of pastoral communities losing their land, especially when these group ranches were subdivided and the land was sold to outsiders. Communities, especially in Kajiado County, really suffered the most because of the proximity to Nairobi and the high demand for land. Therefore, the Kenya Wildlife Service has never been an organization that serves the needs and aspirations of indigenous Kenyans. It has always been a vehicle through which communities are dispossessed of their land or turned into squatters on their land. A classic case, which Andy will post on the chat, a classic case that demonstrates the involvement of the Nature Conservancy in the dispossession of communities of their land is when the Nature Conservancy gave $2 million to the African Wildlife Foundation to purchase land that was then known as Eland Downs, which belonged to the former president Moi. And this land was subsequently transferred to the Kenya Wildlife Service and named the Laikipia National Park. The Samburu community that claimed that this was their ancestral land were later slapped with the cost of the court case. And Kenya wildlife officials would confiscate their livestock and harass them. The US government has continued to fund the Nature Conservancy to acquire more and more land from communities and turn it into exclusive zones for rich white tourists. Communities are then supposed to be satisfied with pocket change that they get from selling beads, dancing for tourists, and being waiters and guides for the tourists. TNC has co-opted key government officers into the board of directors of NRT, including the Kenya Revenue Authority Commissioner of Intelligence and strategic operations. And this is in a brazen act of impunity, whereby there's a clear conflict of interest between these officers serving in their capacity as government agencies, as opposed to them serving in a non-governmental organization that is not answerable to the communities they serve. TNC then fundraises from the US government, gullible Americans, and greedy investors, and uses the funds to steal land and other natural resources from the communities. Currently, TNC controls 50 million acres of land in Africa. Western governments know that aid is a weapon. As Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister of Britain, said, aid corrupts, distorts, and infantilizes, makes people like children. As you can see, some of the people defending NRT don't even know how it's registered, but they just take it like it's gospel truth. It is not by accident that NRT is dispossessing communities of their land. It is by design, and USAID is providing the resources to facilitate this to happen. What has changed? The thing that has changed is that communities are refusing to be robbed. And another thing that has changed is that there is now very high access to information. Most Kenyans have a smartphone and have access to the internet. So communities are sharing information. They are talking to each other about the kind of injustices, and the communities are saying no to Western imperialism and the grabbing of natural resources from them for the sake of Western interest.
Thank you, Violet. I have to say the responses on the chat box actually demonstrate the power of NRT. When people have showed up on behalf of NRT or sent by NRT to make these allegations. The findings of the Institute were actually at the same time, another research institute in Bonn put out a similar report. It's becoming a Dracula that is being dragged into the sunlight, and NRT will have no place to hide or to run. The trend that we depicted about fortress conservation in Kenya is not something special to Kenya alone. Fortress conservation we see all over the globe, especially in Africa, places like Tanzania and Kenya. Our research makes it clear that fortress conservation must be replaced by truly indigenous-led conservation efforts to preserve the remaining biodiversity of the planet while respecting the interests, rights, and dignity of the local communities. There could be nobody better than to push that message out than Mardekai Ogada, co-author of The Big Conservation Lie with Gatu Mabaria. He's a carnivore ecologist and a conservation scholar, but more important, I would say, as I have read his work, an activist scholar who does not hesitate to speak truth to power. Mardekai, I'm going to turn it over to you to share your thoughts on fortress conservation, on NRT, and a Western donor finance model of conservation, which ignores the implications for the communities on the ground. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Anuradha. Yeah, I will not need to go much into the details, like Violet has outlined things very well. What I'll contribute here is that what is happening right now is this model is collapsing under the weight of its own intellectual weakness, if you can call it that. And what has been going on has been hidden in plain sight. Like, I can say for sure, there's no single piece of land in Kenya with the name NRT on the title deed. They're much stealthier than that. What they're exercising is control. And what they're exercising is control by diminishing and completely eliminating the individual, now referring to people as communities, instead of referring to someone by name and their own aspirations, etc. And that places a platform on which human rights can be violated. The other thing is that the way the funding model works is that performance of funders is measured on how much money they give out. And the credit to organizations is measured by how much money they can take in. And what is being funded and sold all over the world, not just Northern Kenya, is narratives. Conservation is just narratives, like carbon credit. Those are all narratives. Net zero, all these narratives, which
turns out to be something like money laundering, because it's money changing hands and no outcomes, no proper outcomes coming the other way. And the type of attacks that happen underscore the role of racism in everything that's going on here. Because even when the Oakland report came out, it wasn't anything new that Black researchers hadn't said, but the panic that you see now is because it came from an organization in the West. I've even read a part where Anuradha is attacked on her racial background, on why she's talking about this. I've been attacked on why I, as someone from Western Kenya, is talking about Northern Kenya. And that shows the weak basis of this thing. So what is happening now is that it's collapsing, and those who claim that NRT have no problem, then they need to ask themselves why the donors are investigating anything if there's no problem. Why are we here? Why are they here if there's nothing of consequence we are discussing here? So we need to look at where we want to go as a nation and as a people, because we're entering into agreements that are restricting people's use of their own lands over periods of 25 years. In many parts of Kenya, 25 years is enough for a child to be born, grow up, and have children of his or her own, under an agreement in which they had no part, and which governs their everyday lives. I personally have been victim of some of these attacks where some people have recently said my family is part of the people who've been poisoning livestock in Northern Kenya. A ridiculous claim, but this shows the desperation, and it's an idea whose time has come. Even the Roman Empire fell when its time came. The Soviet Union fell when its time came. This one will also fall down. And I think what we need to have in place right now is an intellectual structure that will take our people forward, managing their resources for their own sake. Tourism should only be a byproduct of conservation. It should never be the purpose for conservation. And there is no indigenous language in Africa that has a word for conservation, because that's just the way we lived. Conservation is a concept produced by destructive societies. And we cannot take this neoliberalism into management of shared resources. It's a recipe for fragmentation and violence.
Thank you very much, Patikai, and I'm sure we'll hear more from each one of you as we take, if there are any genuine question and answers. Again, Oakland Institute alone takes the responsibility for the report's stealth game. It is based on extensive field research and communication with the communities. As I look at the chat box, I'm reminded of the time when I was at community meetings and people started talking about NRT. In Bulesa, people immediately called the police, and the police came trying to arrest me. All that people wanted to do was speak about the experience with NRT. Unfortunately, the chat box is reminding me where space to share experiences is being taken over. What is NRT afraid of? Time for an independent investigation. Our report came at a very important time, as the international community is considering adopting the 30 by 30 initiative under the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity. We are very fortunate that we have Fio Longo from Survival International to talk more about that. Fio is, in addition to being the Research and Advocacy Officer at Survival International, is also the Director of Survival International, France and Spain. Thank you, Fio, for joining us.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting us here and for being in this panel. It was very shocking, even if I have been doing this work for a long time, to listen to things that have been said here. I am not an expert in Kenya and I won't talk about Kenya, but I would like to say something before I start explaining about the bigger picture, because I'm also a little bit shocked by what is going on in the chat. And I just wanted to point out that human rights abuses, even if just one, even if we are not talking about one here, but even if it was just one, must never be the price to pay for wildlife conservation. Unfortunately, this is not what happened. Conservation today is violating the rights of indigenous peoples all around the world. It's not just Kenya. And this is linked to the fact that there is problem with colonialism. Conservation has a colonial past, has a colonial present, and will have a colonial future if they don't listen to the people and they keep insulting whoever stand up against these human rights violations. If they do care about animals, they should be defending the right of indigenous peoples. 80% of biodiversity in the world is found on indigenous people territories, instead of building safaris on their land. This is what should be really happening. That said, for me, what's important is to mention that what we are hearing today is not just an isolated example. It's not just Kenya where NRT has done something wrong. These are ongoing issues all around the world. I have conducted extensive field research in the Congo Basin and in India. I have been in communities with hunter-gatherer communities in the Congo Basin forest. I have been a lot of time with agriculture communities also in the tiger reserves, living inside tiger reserve in India. And it's always the same thing. It's always the same model. This is a systemic problem. Behind the conservation model that we are talking today, there is an ideology. That ideology is called racism. The funding for what today is happening in Kenya comes from the Western countries, as the same as everyone else in every other country I have to work. The agendas of environmental problems are set up in Brussels and in Washington, not in Kenya. This is where the money comes from. And we are talking about a white agenda that think that local people are not good enough to take care of their land, that a very special, perfect model of how the things should work have to be explained from by the white people to the people, the local people that are living in those countries. Otherwise, communities will collapse. There will be conflict between them because they don't know how to behave, and wildlife will be lost. And white people like wildlife because then they can go as tourists to the Kenyan Conservancies or other place and take pictures and be privileged enough to spend a night in one of the very, very, very expensive safari lodge. As I said, this money coming from the Western countries pay park rangers usually, or support park rangers in different ways. Those park rangers are evicting the people from the land. I'm talking about the places I know. As I said, many countries of Congo Basin and India are evicting the people from their lands, are denying access because all of a sudden the land that where they used to live became a land where in some places they don't have any more access. They can't do any more of their things they have been doing for generations. And these same park rangers commit all sorts of violence. They kill the people, they torture the people, they rape the women. The problem is not just the human rights abuses here, which are of course horrible. The problem is that this is systemic and this is going on with taxpayer money from Western countries. The people like me that lives in Europe, we are giving our taxes and we are giving also donations to organizations that we think they're doing good. And it's very important to hear what they're really doing. And as I said, this is not just a matter of human rights, it's a matter also of taking care of the planet. If we really want to support conservation, we should be supporting the recognition of indigenous people's lands. There can't be any project of conservation that is done in lands where the indigenous people are living and they didn't have their right to the land. First, the first step is to recognize and to support the communities to get their right recognized. And then you can ask them how you can help them to protect their environment. This is not what's happening. It's not just, as I said, a matter of human rights abuses, it's that all this money is going away without any control. NRT or other 100 of WWF or WCS are getting all this money from, as I say, people like me, and no one is reporting. There is no controls. I know that because I have been working very close with other European Commission money going to this kind of project, and there was no control. When human rights abuses allegations were raised to them, they ignored them. Or they said, well, this is the price we have to pay for wildlife conservation. And this is the serious thing, that this is systemic and there is no control. And I think this is one of the things that from the people that are watching this from USA and from other and European countries, I think this is a very important point. This is happening because of us also. And it's our responsibility to take a stand and to stop this. And this is much more important, and this is my last point, because now the governments, especially, as I said, European government, are pushing as a solution to climate change and biodiversity laws to turn the 30% of the earth into protected areas, into lands where indigenous people will lose the access and they will have their activities undermined. And this is their proposal. The proposal to save the planet today is, let's turn the 30% of the planet into a protected area. Today we have 17% of the world as a protected area, including conservancies. Conservancies are also protected areas. And look what we have. The biodiversity loss is increasing, climate change is increasing, and we are violating the human rights of people. So before doing something like the 30%, there should be an investigation into if protected areas are working or not, and especially on the social and human rights impact of these protected areas. And I think this webinar is very important, especially because very soon we will be, most of countries will be agreeing on this 30%.
Thank you, Theo. I welcome questions and answers to the panelists. Please feel free to post them on the Q&A. And to get us started, as some of the people who are posting on a chat box, which has been quite crazy, NRT always attempts to distance itself from the actions of community conservancy boards and claims that any decisions made that were taken were made with the support from the communities. For instance, NRT says that the incorporation of a community conservancy can only be done by the community itself. Conservancies cannot operate or survive if they're not accepted by the community. What would your response be to that? If you still have good connection, I might ask Major Jillo, are you available to answer the question? Or Isaiah or Jeff or Mordecai, Pilot? NRT says that conservancies exist because they are accepted by the communities, and the incorporation can only be done by the community itself. What would your response be? Yes.
I want to respond like this. Here in Baringo, NRT came secretly and established conservancies where there was conflict. And they never involved the communities. They may have good intentions, but the manner in which they came is very interesting. I said, why are the bandits killing innocent people and displacing? If they were really bandits, why are they not even attacking the NRT managed conservancies? Why are they only interested in expanding to make sure that people get displaced from their lands? I want to respond to those defending NRT that most of those defending NRT and the illegal activities are most of the workers of NRT and other NGOs who fear losing the money they are getting, while we, the communities here, are suffering. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. Major Jillo?
In case of Isiolo County, the inception of Biliko Bulesa was actually done with the consent of one single person called Golicha Jarso, who was a former councillor. And there is no public participation at all at the inception of the conservancies by NRT. What they do, they handpick few people, some of them actually who are not indigenous to the county or to the area that they want to extend the new conservancy. They handpick, they promise that they're going to employ their sons, and you find the employees actually come from close relatives, because the entry point is through one person, and then it's told, go and bring your relatives. And they are being told there is a vehicle that they are being given. So the youth are going to be employed. Now, this is how they start inducing people. And what the Isiolo communities are saying, first of all, the land should be registered as a block to allow continuity of the pastoral communities use and access the pasture. They want the land to be subdivided because the local communities are saying subdivision of land will actually give out their land in totality, and the use by wildlife and livestock will be undermined. So the land belongs to everybody. It belongs to the poor, and everybody has got equal rights on the land. So they want the land to be subdivided. And any use of the land, including mining and development, other developments, and also the conservancy, they said, first of all, the land must be registered. This is what NRT doesn't want. So the entry point is through an individual, and then his families. And very few people are the ones who are benefiting from the model of the NRT.
Thank you, Major Jillo. Jeff, if the internet connection is working, I want to make sure we hear from you.
Yeah, I think I'm there now. Well, what I'll say about that, the NRT claiming that they go to the community because the community have invited their services to the community. Let me say this blankly. Recently in Baringo, that's in Samburu County, Samburu North in Kenya. Last year, NRT have stretched themselves from Samburu East to Samburu North now. The reason being, because there are conflict in that area, pitting the Turkana of Samburu and the Samburus of the same place. And because of the peddling element of peace, the armed and all these, they told the leadership, the current leadership now, that they will want to be there and try to bring sanity in that area. My question still to them is, why would they want to go to where there are conflicts? Are they police? Are they mandated? Is it a mandated entity to bring peace within the country and maybe to handle insecurity? That is still a question that begs answers. Further, they are going to Samburu North because Samburu East has had issues. Last year, late last year, and mid of last year until late, what happened is that there was a task force because there was a conflict in Gilai West in Samburu County, Samburu East in Kenya. The residents around the Reteti area were complaining of NRT micromanaging the entity, that's Reteti, Elephant Sanctuary. What happened? The government, through the Ministry of Interior, brought in a board to discuss that. It was chaired by the county, the Samburu sub-county commissioner, Samburu East. What the report came out, NRT were told, the report was very clear that the NRT should stop marginalizing the community further by micromanaging the business, the monies, the assets of NRT, Elephant Sanctuary. And Gilai West community were up saying NRT should give them way. I attended the meeting, the launching of the report, the first report. And so soon, the NRT appealed that report. And again, there was a second sitting and the third, and the report was launched. Still the report said, and the county commission of Samburu was there, that NRT should give way for the community to manage. And there was a composition that was proposed to manage the Namunyak entirety. So my question is, if for sure they are for good, why are they imposing themselves agitatively using the government institutions to really subjugate the residents of the area? So this is my question. If they were genuine, they wouldn't have gone into this. I know they are mouthpiece in social media and everything. Recently, they said Samburu is the NRT is leaving some Samburu Conservancies. Reason, The conservancies are mismanaged. But the community, in other words, are saying it's NRT that is circling the management. It is circling the committee of the area. So that's my position.
Thank you, Jeff. Before we move on to other questions, I wanted to see Mordecai or Violet, if you have a response to the fact they're called community conservancies. Aren't they the conservancies that belong to the communities? What is this whole webinar about? Why are the communities complaining? Would you like to address that briefly?
Yeah, I'd like to just to point out that, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, the initial conservancies were established in land that was already registered as group ranches. This was a category of land that the World Bank pushed to say that pastoralist communities can only economically develop if they have security of tenure. So they then introduced this category of land, which was communal. Certain groups, communities would then be registered, and it had a group ranch committees. Now, there were many problems of governance, and that resulted in a lot of people, a lot of communities getting dispossessed of their land because of the corruption of the committee. Those were the earlier conservancies. So at the end of the day, they were within the group ranch. The later conservancies have been established in land that was classified as trust land. These two categories of land, trust land and group ranches, have now all been brought under the Community Land Act. The problem with the trust land, those are lands that have never been what we call adjudicated. So they've never been registered in any form. They were held in trust by the local authorities. So what NRT does, NRT in these areas, which were former trust land, uses the lowest form of registration of a community organization, which is the community-based organization, which only requires 10 people. You get their details, their ID numbers, and you get them to sign a form. They take it to the Ministry of Gender and Social Services, the local office of the Ministry of Gender and Social Services, and they get a certificate because they've been registered as a CBO. Legally, a community-based organization registered like that is not considered a legal entity as per the way the law holds it in Kenya. Then NRT does something very interesting. It quickly registers a company in the name of that particular conservancy that has started off as a CBO. Now, when it registers a private company can sue and be sued, it can own property. It is considered by law a legal entity. So something that starts with minimal involvement of a community is only 10 members, they can even go up to 50, but it's not the whole community, is then turned into something that then can even enter into contracts with investors for 30 years over this land that is not yet registered. And that's why the communities are asking, why not give the communities a chance to first register this land? Then they can decide as a community, can we enter into these deals? So those are some of the details that these supporters of NRT don't understand. I am a member of a WhatsApp group called Supporting NRT, where they are very abusive. They call me all sorts of names, but it also gives me a chance to see their level of understanding of what is NRT registered in Kenya as. They don't know. Documents that were found by the late Said Wabera, he discovered that NRT is actually registered as a land trust in the Ministry of Lands. These vocals are putting NRT, and they're very rude and abrasive, but we do not look at that. We look at what is it they understand about this structure that is giving them supposed jobs, that is giving them vehicles. They have no clue what it is, how it's registered, and exactly how, when it starts abusing their rights, because it's a matter of time, what recourse do they have, especially when it has co-opted key government institutions inside. So, yeah.
Thank you, Violet, for a very detailed answer. Mordecai, before we move on, any response from you?
Yes, I mean, Violet has outlined it very well, and those are things that they can all refer to the relevant documents to find out. The thing about the governance model is that when NRT is the supporter of a conservancy, i.e. buys a vehicle, fuels the vehicle, services the vehicle, and everything, logistics, when they purportedly have the elections for the group ranch committee, all that needs to be said is that it needs to be known is that NRT wants so and so as chairman, and if so and so gets in, the support from NRT will dry up, which is NRT's right to support who they want to support, and by that way they simply exercise absolute control. And again, if at all these are people who are in control of their conservancies, they wouldn't need NRT. They wouldn't need to be even in this webinar. They would be just out there doing their things and in their conservancies and running them as they see fit. They don't need to listen to us if at all NRT is not in charge of what they're doing. So it's a very simple thing, and people just have to look at their birthright. You don't have to care about what I say. It's wrong even if I didn't say it. What's going on is a problem. And in 2017, I was part of a team that did a study on the violent resource conflict with grazers in Laikipia. And we found that 95% of the Samburu people who had come into Laikipia with their livestock were coming from conservancy areas, and they'd lost access to their dry season grazing areas. And when we wrote the draft report, NRT management called us into a meeting, July 2017, in MS Hotel in Nanyuki, and asked us to doctor that report. And this shows that we had hit the nail on the head even then. And this team included the then CEO and top management. So these are facts on the ground. It doesn't matter what people say. What is true, whether or not Oakland said it or not. Yeah.
Thank you, Mordecai. Thank you for highlighting truth remains the truth, never mind where it comes from. And I just want to acknowledge that the Oakland Institute report is not the first report. There have been endless number of articles and reports before us, more important fact-finding missions that have been led by the communities themselves, the Borana Council of Elders, against activities of NRT. All that we did was to do an independent investigation to look into the allegations that had been made previously and to put it out in the world. There was a question in terms of if there's supporting documentation for the allegations that have been made in the report. Of course, as a policy think tank, we don't just make allegations, they are very rigorously researched. All documentation, supporting documentation is available on our website, oaklandinstitute.org. Also, before the publication of the report, we had shared the findings of the report with NRT, and their response and our response and challenge back to NRT is also available on the Institute's website. For those who have not seen those, I encourage them to visit our website. There's a question around Turkana. If Oakland Institute extended the research to Turkana, where there was a pushback from the community. Our report does mention Turkana and the fact that NRT was asked to leave by the governor of Turkana. Is there anyone on the group who might want to address briefly the situation in Turkana? Please raise your hand and let me know. I know we don't have a speaker from Turkana. Okay. Yeah, if you look at our report, we do talk about Turkana and as to how the governor of Turkana asked NRT to leave. And again, other communities have filed court cases. All of the documentation is available on our website. I have a question for you, Theo, which is, as somebody who's doing similar research and advocacy around the globe, first of all, how often do you see, and you touched upon it, this impact of fortress conservation? And also wondering what an alternative solution could be for nature conservation that would not harm local communities. I would definitely open that question to each of the panelists, but I would love to start with you, Theo.
Yes, well, actually, the reply is quite easy. It's actually surprising that we are still pushing for the wrong model, where we have so many scientific evidence that show that biodiversity goals are reached better when communities are in control of their land, when their rights are recognized. There is less deforestation in lands that are owned and possessed as collective rights by indigenous and local communities. And there is much more biodiversity. The 80% of biodiversity is found on indigenous people's land. There is a lot of studies where they compared actually indigenous territories in those places where the legislation allows the recognition, for example, in several countries of Latin America. They compare these indigenous territories with protected areas. And the studies are very clear. Indigenous territories are performed better than protected areas. And it's not that we need to have a PhD in Cambridge or Harvard to understand why. This is very clear. People, indigenous people and local communities depend on the land for living. They don't go to most of the cases, to the supermarket as we do in Europe. And they are, of course, the best place to protect this land because they know that is their future. They know their land better than anyone else. We actually in Europe look quite stupid when we go to visit indigenous communities. They know every single tree and they know exactly what to do to protect those lands. It's not really a mystery. Nevertheless, even if every scientific evidence, and here people in Europe really like science, and every scientific evidence are saying this is the right direction. So why we are going in the other direction? To reply to this, I will reply to your question about if this everywhere. I don't know any protected area in Africa that has been done with the consent of the people living there. In Asia, we have cases, reported cases, very similar to the ones you were talking about, from India, Nepal, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and I could continue all the day. So this is very systemic. This is the colonial model of conservation that has been imposed in every country that has been colonized by Europeans. And including, this was the model of conservation in the United States. The first national parks in the United States evicted indigenous peoples and were based on this kind of racist colonial model. And this is why it's so difficult to change it, because this is the biggest mythology and maybe one of the last mythologies that the Western world has. It has such a powerful and very long past. We are talking about this model of conservation is based also, so it first born in the United States with its national park, that has been imported and in Africa. And the vision of Africa that Europeans brought and that nourished this conservation model is the idea of wilderness. They went there and they saw these big animals and this wonderful nature, and they imagined that nature empty. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to colonize it. They say there is no one living here. There are some indigenous people, but they will destroy the nature if we leave them alone. And this idea of wilderness, of the fact that nature is an empty space that we need to protect from humans. The idea that only Westerns can protect that, and especially science can protect those places. It is very enrooted in our vision, in the global North vision of nature. We think about nature as something separate of us, something that we need to protect, that we need to conserve, or that we need to exploit, or that we need to enjoy as a tourist paying for it. Nature is a capital that gives us a service. And I think this is when the conservation model becomes so difficult to change, because it's a whole ideology and a vision of nature. Indigenous people don't think that nature, they need to protect nature. They just live there and they won't destroy it because they need nature. It's something, it's reciprocity, is a relationship. We think of nature as an object outside us that we need to conquer, to exploit, or to use, or to enjoy. And I think this is why conservation is so difficult to change. There is nothing today that is an obstacle to do that. I mean, we could very easily stop supporting portrait conservation and just turn and start supporting indigenous peoples. But we can't, because we are blind. We can't see that nature is not an empty space. It's the land of people that have been shaped and nourished that land for generations. And I think there is an alternative model. Yes, there is. And we should be supporting that.
Thank you, Theo. That was extremely well said. Instead of lauding the stewards of the land, those who have protected the areas where there's more biodiversity, this Western-led notion of clearing the lands of people so it can be colonized, and that's seen as conservation. And that has been, and despite the evidence that the best way to do conservation is to recognize the rights of the communities and honor them as the stewards of the land. Major Jillo, I was wondering, since we're talking about land, we have talked about the conflict with NRT, if you would be able to speak to the relationship that the communities have with the land. Why are people upset? What do they depend on this land for? I had the opportunity to hear from the communities directly, but I wonder if you would share the relationship that the pastoralists have with the land, whether it is in Biliko Bulesa or whether it is in other conservancies that we have talked about. Major Jillo, if you would unmute yourself.
Actually, the pastoral communities have a lot of understanding about the environment. The land has a lot of meaning to them. Without land, they will lose culture. Their identity will be threatened. Now, they understand the use of every plant, every trees, every landscape has got meaning to them. For the naming ceremony of their children, for the ritual purposes, they depend on the landscapes and the trees. The medicinal value of every plant on the rangeland. Now, the livestock is actually taken for pasture depending on the season. And they coordinate the use of the pasture, with the wildlife. It is entrenched in the cultural law of the Borana community. They believe the wildlife belongs to them. God gave them, precious to them, and of equal value with the livestock that they have. Any threat to wildlife is punishable. Denial of pasture and water to the wildlife is punishable in the law. And this law, the custodian is the Data Council of Elders. The Data Council of Elders has been there for so many years. Not everybody can be a member of the Data Council of Elders. This is actually inherited, and there are parameters to be looked into for somebody to qualify as a member of the Council of Elders. They must have knowledge on protection of environment, knowledge on the culture, and they have got a role to transmit that indigenous knowledge to the young generation. And when NRT came in, they actually studied. They got all the information about the wildlife and environment for the local community. And they imposed themselves as experts after stealing the indigenous knowledge from the local communities and undermine the cultural structure which has been existing to manage the resources and the wildlife. So that brought a lot of conflict. They formed a parallel council of elders, which actually have not been entitled culturally within the community. That caused a lot of undermining. It brought a lot of conflict within the communities, even at a household level. The knowledge that the community has not been written down in books, but naturally available to every member of the community. And there is equality for all members. Unfortunately, this has been undermined with purpose. And when you find the partnership that the Kenya Wildlife Service has not been encouraging to have good partnership with the communities in protection of environment, in protection of wildlife. So this has been deliberately been put in place for this by these external forces that we are seeing today in form of NRT. So that is how much that the community has attachment to their landscape, to the ancestral land, which they don't want it to be divided. It is actually the worst violation of human rights to interfere with the use of land. And initial understanding about the land registration, which it was funded by French Development Agency, that the community resolved 100% in strength that the land should not be demarcated in small parcels. It has to be done in blocks to allow the use by the wildlife and livestock to coexist. And every plant has got a meaning, has a racial meaning. It is loved by all the members of the communities. They use for actually cleaning their teeth. They use for medicine. The springs, like the ones the NRT fenced off, has got of medicinal value. It has hot water springs. Some have got a natural salt that the wildlife and animals jointly can lick while on the surfaces or drink water. So it is being praised in the songs and dances of these communities and transmitted to the local community, to the children, as part of the roles of women has a role in protection of this. When they make the gods, if a girl is going to be married, every girl must go with one god made by either grandmother or the mother, not more than one. Because if they get more, that will destroy the plant where they harvest either from the barks or the roots of some species of the plants. It is being supervised by the time that women go out to harvest the barks of the tree to make such kind of god. It is first of all consulted after the marriage is going to be announced. Then they say what part of the plant is going to be used, from which area. First of all, they do the surveillance and agree. Now, that tree is not allowed to be destroyed. The grandmothers are supervising majestically, teaching how it can be harvested, what quantity can be accepted to be harvested at any given time during the marriage ceremony. All these are actually covered in the law, in the cultural law of the Borana community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Major Jillo. That was a beautiful description of relationship that communities have with nature. And I think this is the challenge, that fear you were talking about, where the Western society and the Western model of conservation does not recognize that it is not a transactional relationship with nature, but a symbiotic relationship with the whole territory and not just a piece of land which can get conservation dollars. As we saw in the chat box, by the way, a very warm welcome to all the NRT employees and others who joined. We are very glad that you took the time late in the evening to join us and for putting forward your suggestions. there's a question, as we can say, it is a highly polarized issue. I'm not sure if it's really a polarized issue when NRT employees join to put in their comments and engage in name calling of community members. However, what should be done about this? Because it seems like there are NRT employees as well as people who have been sent in by NRT to post their comments, which kind of reframe the voices of the community. So what should be done? There's a question, is there common ground approach? You know, I always think of when there's a conflict like this, I'm reminded of South Africa. Before there can be reconciliation and common ground, there needs to be for the truth. And this is why the Oakland Institute has called for the truth telling, has called for a real investigation. Dunedin last year apparently did an investigation. With COVID, they could not visit the communities on the ground, but they did not even have Zoom meetings with those who have been petitioning them. They did not speak to the Jillo human rights defenders. They did not speak to the journalists who have been writing to them. Those petitions to Dunedin are available on our website. They're not made up stuff. So in terms of where do we go from here? If I were to turn that question to you, where do we go from here? What are the demands of the communities? We list some of those demands in our report, Stealth Game. Of course, an investigation into NRT's alleged role in ethnic tensions and fueling ethnic tensions and you know, the alleged extrajudicial killings to other things. But what are some of the ways forward? If I may turn first to you, Mordecai, and then I'll kind of go to each of the speakers. What is the way forward in such a situation?
I think having experience in managing conservation programs, we always have audit, financial audit. Every donor, especially those who give you significant amounts of money, will demand a financial audit every year, and will even appoint auditors to do it. It would be a simple step to have a social ethics audit. Independent auditors like the financial one. The financial one is never your friend or your brother or a community member or whatever. He's just an auditor. So we should have ethics governance audits for these things, especially some of these programs that are so expansive geographically. They're impacting hundreds of thousands of lives. And if we can put together an audit mechanism, then it can simply say everything's going well. It can point out problems where they are. But right now, donors are in a trap. When you've given someone $20 million, you put yourself in a box. You can't afford to question what they're doing, because the question would come back to you, why did you give them that much money? And that's what happens. And it gets to be a runaway train where everyone is getting a piece of the money and no one wants to rock the boat or stop the gravy train. And there's no audit. So this presents a big challenge. That's why even government itself has parliament. It has the Auditor General's office. It has the judiciary. Here we have what is like a quasi-government, and it has none of those governance organs. And this is, even if this was in another country, it would go wrong. If that much money is given into one organization without proper ethics audit mechanisms, it doesn't matter what part of the world it is, it would go wrong. So I think that would be a place that the donors and organizations, a logical place to start.
Thank you, Mordecai. An ethical audit, as millions of dollars are written to a single organization as to how those resources are being used and what benefits actually accrue to the local communities. Jeff, may I, and I'm going to ask each one of the panelists, what is the way forward? What are some of the demands of the communities in the face of allegations that are made against NRT and reports such as the Oakland Institute? Jeff, would you like to share some thoughts in terms of what is the way forward?
Yes, well, Anuradha, there's one thing that is like boggling minds of the residents of Samburu. For instance, if you see the force the NRT is using in social media, in media itself, no formal media, the mainstream media, the voices of the community are always put down. Sometimes when trying to amplify their voices, give them voice, sometimes it means it may not reach anywhere, and the voices are still dumb in their villages. So to me, they need to revisit. Some investigation must be done. Some audit must be done, as Modogai said, to revisit or to trace back on this issue of the agreements. How are they coming about? What is the money that's given for a certain activity? How about the peace they are saying? How about their group ranges? All these things must be discussed in an open forum. I know for sure the Council of Elders from Samburu have written a petition to county government of Samburu. They have taken to county assembly, but it's down in the shelves. Nobody has ever discussed it. So you can imagine how the stretch they have gone. It's huge, it's big. So it's like the quasi-government, as Modogai has put it. So to handle it, it's a very serious thing. It's only the donors who must put this to their minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, another speaker saying that if all of these allegations are wrong, let there be a real investigation, hear the voices of the communities, address endless petitions that have been done by the communities. And if NRT is really about community conservancies, why would they not be addressed? Isaiah, any feedback from you, any response as to what would be the way forward? What are some of the things the communities are asking for? If they could speak to the donors, what would you want the message to be?
I want the donors to come to the communities and listen to the voices. The use of violence, like what is happening in Baringo, and suppressing the local voices is unacceptable. It's against it's a great injustice to the people. I want the donors of NRT to come and engage the communities. What we are witnessing is unacceptable. It's a gross human rights violation. And lastly, I want to tell the employees of NRT who have been defending the employer here that their jobs will not be there permanently if this thing continues of violation of community rights. They should listen to the voices of the community and stop going to the same bed with the oppressors who are oppressing the indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. Violet, any feedback from you in terms of, especially for the donors?
Okay, for me, I'd like to first point out that there needs to be global concerted effort to control the Nature Conservancy. Right now, the Nature Conservancy, as it boasts on its posts, is controlling 50 million acres in Africa. It is having impacts in Latin America, in Asia. It's this rogue, huge institution. It is also targeting water resources. The people, the NRT supporters, they're always asking me, why do I always raise this issue? And I keep saying, which they never understand, the monster you're feeding in northern Kenya is coming and working with Coca-Cola and East Africa breweries to privatize Nairobi water under what they call the Nairobi Water Fund. And it is doing this through donor funding from governments like USAID, but also through the Global Environment Facility. I was one time in a devaluation for IFAD, the International Fund of Agriculture Development. And TNC has received $2 million of grant from the Global Environment Facility, which is an allocation for Kenya, which was then used as co-financing so that IFAD could advance to Kenya loans worth $68 million for what they call the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund Upper Tana Conservation Project. These structures that are there denying communities their rights while claiming to be there for the sake of the people, we need to be checking them. And like Fury said, Western citizens need to check, because they're being targeted in terms of donations. Right now, I've registered under TNC to actually receive, they think I'm an investor from Texas. So they're always sending me these beguiling posts telling me how I can, $1 of mine can go and conserve these large areas in Kenya, or they've got all these very nice sounding nonsense because they're targeting me as an investor. Then even in social media, we've met people who say, my grandfather always used to donate to TNC because I didn't know this is where the money is going. So we need to create this awareness. And my last challenge is, we as Kenyans, we are not children. There is nobody who's going to come from God knows where and solve our problems. We have to man up and woman up and start doing the hard work of conserving our resources, of restoring our own dignity, and stop being bribed with tiny little, small little inducements like a vehicle. Today, a community in Northern Kenya can be able to sell some livestock and be able to buy their own vehicle. Why are we so cheap? We need to get man up and woman up and start looking after our resources. Otherwise, we're going to be enslaved again. And this would be worse than the previous enslavement that happened during the colonial times. So I think it's all of us who take charge of our realities, and we check these huge organizations that are pretending to be doing good for Africa. Why would you be coming to do good for me? You don't know me. So we as Kenyans, let's take charge of our own management of our own resources. Let's take charge of our institutions, because they have been taken over by the imperialists. The Kenya Wildlife Service does not serve our interests. We as middle class Kenyans, educated Kenyans, including all the ones who are on social media right now supporting NRT, why aren't you getting involved in the management of your natural resources through your Kenya Wildlife Service local office, instead of singing about NRT, which you don't even know how it is formed or who it belongs to? So let's take responsibility. That's my way forward.
Thank you, Violet. Theo, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to add a point of what here the wonderful panelist said. There is something more that I think people should be aware. As I said, there is a lot of things to do. At least I'm talking from a European perspective. Also in the USA, there is a lot of wrong legislation of funding going to conservation, but there is something else to know. The NRT projects are also selling carbon credits from the Conservancies. Those carbon credits are being bought, in this particular case, by corporations like Facebook and Netflix. So I think this is a very important point for people, especially from the global north, because everyone here is very concerned about climate change. And this is actually the way that the solutions that our governments or business are proposing are this. Let's limit the access to land from indigenous peoples and other local communities in Africa or in Asia. So our corporations here can keep polluting and destroying the environment while buying carbon credits from that have been created through the eviction of the people that were living there. So we can compensate our emissions. I think this is a completely wrong model. It's destroying the planet. And I think this is something else that communities and also the angry people that are here, most of them employees of NRT, should understand. A lot of corporations in the USA and in Europe are not respecting the climate agreement by buying carbon credits from lands where they are supposed to be living. And a lot of people is making a lot of money from it, and not Kenyan people, European and USA-based people are making a lot of money. This is another problem that I am adding to this conservation model. So it's not just evicting the people, it's not just violating human rights. Now it's also giving a false solution to climate change through the sold of carbon credits. I just wanted to raise that there is a lot to do on this. Corporations and governments shouldn't be able, or even individuals, to buy carbon credits where there are human rights abuses happening and from projects that didn't have the consent of the people. These are basic principles. They should be written somewhere. There should be a law about it. but there is nothing like that. So as Mordecai was saying, there's no audited. I can say it from, I work from also doing lobbying to the European Union Commission. I know all the laws and agreements, and there is no due diligence. No one is going to Kenya before signing an agreement with NRT to understand how the situation is. So I can say that it is really like this. So there is a way forward. Europeans who are giving money should be putting pressure on the government, should be putting pressure on the organizations and corporations that are supporting this kind of model.
Thank you very much, Fio. That was going to be my next question, which you have addressed, which was about carbon credits. I want to thank everyone. What we have heard today is a classic case of Western dominated, Western pushed conservation model, which really, results in fortress conservation in the name of conservation, which sounds very good, protection of the environment, which comes at the expense of communities, their livelihoods, and their lives itself. The Oakland Institute report, which is based on a lot of documentation, all of that is available on our website, puts forward clear demands of an investigation and ethical audit, as Mordecai calls for. Donors who are sending millions of dollars are responsible and have to be held accountable for the wrongdoings of the NRT. If there is a different picture on the ground that we got wrong, an investigation needs to happen instead of social media and the trolls that were on the chat box. I do hope that the employees of NRT who joined our session today had some time to also listen to the voices of the communities. A conservation model which is so unsustainable will not last. It is very important, as Violet and Jeff and Major Jillo and Isaiah have pointed out, that communities-based conservation is the one that is actually successful. This recording of the seminar will be made available to all the donors. Our advocacy and push from donors to as well as the purchasers of the carbon credits, Facebook, Netflix will continue. The communities are very organized as they resist this very top-down, militarized conservation model. The need for investigation into the extrajudicial killings has to be done by the Kenyan government and the police, and independent. And the light is shining. This report, Stealth Game, has sunlighted the issue in Kenya, and it is not going to be going away. Before we end the seminar, I wanted to just turn it over and see to if you have a quick word, any of the panelists, before we end the webinar today. I will start by Major Jillo. Any last word to the audience today?
Actually, what I'm seeing is that the donors are corrupt, because when Danida sent team for the evaluation, they came with their pressmen, and then they are being controlled by the agents of NRT. The embassies representatives, who are actually Kenyans but employed by the embassies, are used as an agent to do a dialogue between NRT and the community whenever the grievances are being aired by the community members. So that act is actually pure corruption. So donor countries must be aware of that. This must be exposed. And when independent investigations are being done, that should be looked into, because America says it's the best democracy in the world. But when you look at what is happening through NRT, everything is being micromanaged. After the launch of the report by Oakland Institute, what happened? You find representative of the Canadian Embassy, of Britain, American Embassy, the political advisor. They come to the community here, pick some individuals who are working in those organizations, and lobby to meet some individual elders so that things will be reversed. They talk to the local human rights organizations from the community and said, this report should be countered. What do you call that? That should be, it is actually a pure corruption. And during the investigations, that must be actually brought out and made public to the entire world.
Thank you, Major Jillo. Jeff?
Well, my position is, and this one goes to the donors. They should listen to this. When they hear voices from the communities, even if it's 1, 2, 3 from different points, they should say, wait a minute, what's happening? As opposed to good proposal writing from the NRT team, they must always ask them, what is happening? Why are these voices coming up? If for sure, this they're saying is community driven, if for sure that's it, then why are the noises? Why are people saying something's wrong? Why are they arming people? Where are the notions or the stories of extrajudicial killing? Why are we hearing that? This is what the donors must ask first. And they must make a trial to visit these communities silently. The problem here is when we see the embassies in Kenya from these countries funding NRT, the ambassadors always visit the lower downs. So basically that tells also the communities or some of us, something strong is not coming out, will not come out of it. And for instance, me, I'm a journalist and a filmmaker. There are stories that we have, a lot of confession from the people. We have stories that will tell the other side of what these guys are writing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Isaiah, any final words before we go to Violet and Mordecai?
Okay, final, I want to say that if the donors are listening, the funders of NRT and anybody else defending NRT, if they think that we in the local community, we are lying the way they have claimed, let them come to Baringo. We are being killed by these people. We are being displaced. The donor should not trust the politicians. The donor should stop signing agreements with the politicians on our behalf who are mortgaging us, displacing us from our lands. That should stop because it's making us suffer. And finally, to the workers of NRT who have been defending them, please be humane and have sympathy with us because we are being killed. There is enough evidence. If there will be investigation, I think it should start from Baringo. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaya. Violet, any final words, and then Mordecai.
Okay, my final word is a bit controversial because I was part of that Danida evaluation. And when, as a national consultant, when NRT found out, they called the embassy and I was requested by the firm, the consultancy firm that we were conducting the evaluation with, to recuse myself and not to be involved in any of the interviews with regard to NRT, and also not to influence their decision. But that notwithstanding, they were able to meet with a team from Northern Kenya. The late Said Wabera and even Major Jillo actually had a Skype call with the Danida team. But when you see what was written in the report, it's very watered down and it is deliberate. And that is what I would like to talk to my fellow Kenyans. Donors have a vested interest in coming and accessing our resources for their citizens. So, like for example, Danish Vespa company, and as part of a consortium of Scandinavian donors, were involved in the grabbing of 150,000 acres, or is it hectares, in Turkana under the Lake Turkana wind farm. They are not angels brought from above to come and help us. They have vested interest. I think it's time we grew up as citizens and understood that. so that we push back and are able to negotiate with these donors. They are not innocent. They know the kind of organization NRT is, because it has co-opted government officers that, even according to good governance, is part of conflict of interest. Yet they continue to fund this opaque institution, because this opaque institution under the Nature Conservancy is pushing their interest, and that way they're coming and harvesting our resources and taking them to their countries. I think we need to know that that is what's happening, so that we negotiate with them, so that they don't oppress us completely, because they are not averse to taking everything and leaving us suffering from malnutrition and starvation. The West has shown it has no mercy, not even to its own citizens. It will enslave and it will exploit, including animals, for their own benefit. I think it's time we became realistic and realized that's what's happening, and started negotiating and pushing back so that the exploitation can reduce.
Thank you, Violet. Mordecai, you're on mute.
Thank you, and Violet has covered a lot of it very well. The thing is that where the world is going now, the future does not belong to the military industrial complex. The future belongs to those who can think for themselves and chart their own paths. The thought that somebody from thousands of miles away can come and purport to chart a path for hundreds of thousands of people here is ludicrous. Even as they question my words as someone from a few hundred kilometers away, they welcome the words of people from overseas. So it's just that we need to get real, and we need to talk. And a lot of the people who are here sort of flinging stones will be surprised to find that their bosses are talking to me, and we will continue to talk to them, and we will work out a way of doing this thing right, because there is always a right way. The problem that's going on in northern Kenya and so many other parts is that we are choosing the less sustainable and the path of immediate instant gratification. Something that costs millions of dollars a year cannot be defined as sustainable. Something defended by guns and fences cannot be described as sustainable. And sustainability is not nature. Sustainability is social, political, and cultural, and nature and everything. So we must raise our discourse to a higher intellectual level, and certainly we will do that, and we will find a way forward. And we will be meeting with some of these people, and they will hear from me. It's not about my power. These are problems that exist outside Mordecai. So there's this tendency to think that Violet is the problem. If Violet didn't exist, there'd be no problem. Or Mordecai is the problem. If Mordecai wasn't here, we'd be okay. You know, that's not the case. What is there on the ground is there on the ground. And that's why the donors are investigating. If there was nothing, the donors wouldn't be investigating anything. They would not be questioning anything. So I think a way forward will be found, and it's good that independent organizations like Oakland Institute have done this, because when the report first came out, the immediate reactions was that this is something for Mordecai Ogada, and I had nothing to do with it. I had never even met Anuradha. So now I think a few people know that there is a problem that needs to be discussed. If there was no problem, even these people who are on this chat, on this webinar, would not be here. That's why we are here, because there's a problem. And I think now we've started to move forward towards addressing that problem. And I think things can only get better, because I don't think it can get any worse and careless and corrupt than it is now.
Thank you, Mordecai. Theo, before we end today, any last thoughts?
No, yes, it will be very briefly said, just that I do think that the reactions we had tonight and other things that are happening are a very good sign, even if now it just seems not very nice. When we launched the campaign against abuses of WWF in Cameroon, a long time ago, 2014. And we sent the first letter to WWF 30 years ago. So no one believed us. It was like this. It was like a lot of people saying, you are lying. How can you say that? WWF is such a good organization. And then little by little, independent investigations start going on. And then it was the press. And then European Commission, who said into my face I was lying about the BACA, did conduct their own investigation. The UNDP conducted their own investigation. And then little by little, people start saying, oh my God, everyone was saying exactly the same. These human rights abuses are happening. And of course, the first reaction when you are saying something that is real, and especially to people that work in an organization, is this is not happening. It can be true, because it's a direct attack in what they believe. I think this is part of the process. This is not a personal fight against NRT employees or even against NRT. This is a fight against a model that is wrong, a model that allows white people in rich countries to live in the way they live, exploiting other countries, and then pretending they want to stay part of the forest so they can go there on their land, so they can go on holidays and take pictures. And this, we have to say it in our face. We are supporting, we in the Western countries, this kind of conservation, so we can keep going on whatever we are doing without changing our way of life. And I think that it's very bad it's very sad that not everyone knows this in Africa, but this is the way it is. And I think conservation is just part of this neoliberal model. It's one of the other parts. There wouldn't be conservation as it is today if we were not destroying the planet as we are doing it. So I think most of the Western countries and policies and people need to decolonize themselves, probably me including, just to not keep me away. And I think it's very important to do this exercise. It's vital, not only for the people, but also for nature and the planet. That's it.
Thank you, Fia. Yes, I agree. It is a process. And I think in the journey towards justice, today's webinar was a part of that process of that truth telling. And this work shall continue till they're actually independent investigations. There have been many questions around solutions. There's a desire for this magical solution. The good news is that around the world, there are also examples of conservation, which are actually community-led, which are community-owned, where the lands are not owned by any, but owned by the communities, instead of privatized model of conservation. So those solutions exist, but for them to be able to prosper and for them to be able to spread, we have to take head-on examples such as NRT, which lead to dispossession, which lead to vast human rights abuses. The work that has started and will continue will lead to independent investigations. I want to acknowledge each one of you who very courageously joined me on this webinar organized by the Oakland Institute. We saw the name calling that went on in the chat box, and we know what goes on in social media. As Alison, who started this webinar by calling out the land defenders, on behalf of the Institute, I want to acknowledge each one of you, Fiore, Mordecai, Violet, Jeff, Major Jillo, Isaiah, and hundreds of community members that I met, for your courage and for the work that you lead as land defenders. Thank you. Thank you to all the listeners and participants who joined in and have stayed with us. I had said it will be 1.5 hours, but we're coming close to 2 hours, with deep appreciation until we have success for community justice and land rights. Goodbye for now.